back in Miami, and we're really excited. Please have a seat. We've got some great announcements today. With me here is our Attorney General, Ashley Moody. Commissioner of the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, Mark Glass. From the Homestead Police Department, Captain Fernando Morales is with us. Kevin Loughran from Wilton Manors Police Department is here. We also have Representatives Fabricio and Barrero joining us from the Florida House. And we have Megan Gillotti as a mother from Broward County, whose story we will hear a little bit later. Thanks to the PBA for hosting us. You may have surmised that today's announcement is going to be about law and order. And we are very proud that we are a law and order state. We've seen a lot of jurisdictions around this country indulge in what I would say are faddish thinking, attacking law enforcement, thinking that you can solve some of these problems through things like social services instead of police on the street when you have dangerous people. So there's been some experiments done, and I think it's been really disastrous in far too many parts of the country. But what have we done in the state of Florida? You never saw us defund police in the state of Florida. Not on my watch. Not going to happen. So we not only rejected that, we were able to sign legislation to prevent local governments at any part of Florida from defunding law enforcement. They can try, but we're going to make sure the money's there, and we're going to make sure that our citizens are protected. We've also instituted increased penalties in the wake of those 2020 riots to make sure that if people are doing that, mob behavior, violent type of rioting, that they're actually held accountable, not just slapped on the wrist and put right back on the street. We recognize that police were not being treated well in other parts of the country, so for 2 years in a row, we did $1,000 bonuses for every sworn law enforcement officer in the entire state of Florida. We tried to capitalize and have capitalized on our reputation for supporting law enforcement by offering recruitment bonuses, not just for people coming out of state, but also young people who've never been in law enforcement if they choose it. So our program that launched July 1st gives a $5,000 signing bonus for people that are new, and it's not just state agencies. It could be sheriff's departments and local municipal agencies. And so we've already done more than 1,000 recruitment bonuses to new officers throughout the state. And with the $1,000 bonuses and the $5,000 bonuses, the money's nice, especially when you have a period of inflation. And our $1,000 bonuses, people say, like, well, you know, what about the tax? We paid the taxes on that, so you actually got a $1,000 take home, which is very important. But people appreciate that. But more than the money, I think, is just showing, hey, the state of Florida really appreciates what I'm doing, that they would send us this bonus payment, or the state of Florida really appreciates the fact that I'm joining in Florida by doing the $5,000 bonus. So that really, I think, has been the biggest part of it. We've also increased penalties for those who are dealing in fentanyl and fentanyl analogs, and that has killed a lot of people in our country, particularly in recent years. We have worked to help with the border issue in Texas, because you've seen so many amounts of drugs, you've seen criminal aliens pour in, and we had state law enforcement down there for a period of time. We've also taken a very strong stand against the idea that prosecutors can pick and choose which laws that they enforce. You know, our view is that if you disagree with the law in the books, run for the legislature and try to change it. But you do not get to be a law unto yourself. We had an example of that in Tampa, and so we suspended that prosecutor from his position. And so all of that is great, and I'm proud of it. I'm proud of the work that everybody does throughout the state of Florida. And we know that the other policies that have been tried have not been successful. But what about what's the results been? Well, right now, the state of Florida, our crime rate is at a 50-year low. Overall crime down nearly 10% year over year. Murder down 14%. Burglary down 15%. And robbery down 7% year over year. Here in Miami-Dade County, thanks to the great work that the men and women in uniform do every single day, the murder rate dropped by 15% between 2020 and 2021 and dropped a further 38% through the first half of 2022. And so you have, I think, good policies in the state of Florida, dedicated to law and order. Clearly, the state supports the mission of what goes on, but you have folks with that support who are able to go out and protect our communities. And so we really appreciate the work that goes into it. You can tell when you don't have those things in place, all hell can break loose, like we've seen in many of these other places. I was just in Philadelphia the other day, and their murder rate, I think, is at levels they haven't seen in decades. Retail theft, all kind of burglaries, all this stuff. And that's a direct result of the policies that they have embraced to go very soft on crime and to give the criminals the upper hand. So we're not doing that in the state of Florida. We have not done it, but we also want to make sure we keep the momentum going. And so we have a legislative session coming up, and we want to make sure that we cement our reputation as being a law and order state and take actions as necessary to help further protect the people of the state of Florida. So we're going to be offering a number of reforms here today. We've worked with the Attorney General on this. We've spoken with members of the legislature, and I think that we're going to be able to do really, really well coming up with a really strong law and order package. The first issue that we're going to tackle is many people in South Florida. Remember, you had the killer at the Parkland massacre. Obviously, he was guilty. Why it took so long to even get to the penalty phase, is beyond me. He gets up there, and then you have like one juror that did not want to do capital punishment, and that requirement was really based off an old Florida Supreme Court decision that has since been overturned. And so you shouldn't have it to where if you're already convicted and you did the crime, whether to apply capital, one juror should not be able to veto that. And I don't think justice was served in that case. If you're going to have capital, you have to administer it to the worst of the worst crimes. And so we're going to be working with the legislature to reform that statute so that, yes, it should be the vast majority, supermajority, but you don't want to have where one juror, because what happens is you can get someone that gets on, they're not supposed to, but they can get on the jury if they oppose capital. And I have no problem if you oppose capital. Many people do. But that's the law in Florida, and so you've got to be willing to administer that. One can get on and maybe scuttle it, but if you need 3 or 4 to scuttle, it makes it much more difficult. So we're going to be working with them to make sure that we get that reform in place. We're also going to build up what we've done on fentanyl. We've increased mandatory minimums for both fentanyl and fentanyl analogs. But one of the things we've been seeing that's very troubling, I mean, they will jam fentanyl into almost anything nowadays. So they'll actually do it and make it look like candy that's been dubbed a rainbow fentanyl. And then just 2 days in August, Customs and Border Patrol seized more than 250,000 multicolored fentanyl pills. And we're going to take action against this because this is really targeting our youngest and most vulnerable kids. This is not something that you can do and, maybe you have some side effects, but you get over it. I mean, you really could, the lights can go out with these fentanyl overdoses, and the chance of a fatality is much higher than with many other drugs. And so we're going to make it a first-degree felony to possess, sell, or manufacture fentanyl or other controlled substances to look like candy. And going to add a mandatory life sentence and $1 million penalty if you're targeting children with this type of fentanyl. Now, arrests for fentanyl and opioids, as many people in this room understand, are routinely made by our local law enforcement agencies. And we know that not every county has as much money, say, as maybe Miami-Dade County does. We know that there's a need to have costs covered for some of the things that go into this. So we're going to include another $20 million in my upcoming budget recommendations in local support funding for law enforcement agencies to increase efforts to interdict and apprehend the illicit sale and trafficking of fentanyl. And I know that that money will be very, very well spent. We also have, from the very beginning in the state of Florida, rejected the idea that you get rid of things like cash bail, like they did in New York and like they just recently did in Illinois. New York, I think, was one of the first states that had done this. When the policy first went into effect, the first week of their no cash bail policy, there was a woman in New York that was arrested, released, and rearrested 4 times in 7 days. First, she smashed a window to break into an elementary school and pulled a fire alarm. Arrested, released. Then she sprayed graffiti on a bank, caught and released. Then she broke into somebody's car, arrested, charged with grand larceny, released. And round out this terrible, horrible, no good, very bad week of being an unpunished outlaw. She tried to steal a can of beer from a 7-Eleven on her way out. She threw a rock through the window of the store. And so what I've found when you look at some of the incidents that happen around the country, but including here in Florida, you know, we've had police officers killed. And you look at the guy's rap sheet, and some of these people have been arrested and released like a dozen times, 15 times, and you're thinking to yourself, what is going into them being put back out? It seems like there's people don't want to take full responsibility for dealing with some of these problems. So we're not going to do like New York or Illinois for sure in terms of doing any of that. But we also just want to make sure that if somebody is committing criminal offenses, of course, you have due process, you go through, they got to prove you guilty, that's the state's burden, and that's how it'll always be. But just cycling people back out on the street if they can commit additional crimes, that is not helping these communities. So we're going to make sure that things like New York and Illinois and what happens do not happen in Florida. And so we are going to limit who is eligible for release prior to the first appearance. I mean, if you are charged with something that's really serious, I think that the expectation should be that you remain until your first appearance. We're going to make sure that judges are the ultimate decision maker when it comes to detention. Sometimes, you know, the prosecutor just let them go, and we have different flavors of prosecutors, as people have seen, in terms of how they view We want to make sure that we have all attempted sexual misconduct offenses, including attempted sexual battery, be included in the list of crimes ineligible for gain time while serving their sentence. So you can commit the crime fully, no gain time. If you're stopped and you attempt and you fail through not because you decided not to do it, then somehow you're eligible, but your criminal intent was the same as what somebody who actually committed it. So we are going to do that, and we think that that'll make a big, big difference. So at the end of the day, all systems go in the state of Florida. I think what we found out across the country is don't take safe communities for granted. You know, New York went through all this in the 70s and 80s. It was a disaster. They brought in Giuliani, and then they had a real change in approach, and it was really, really good policing. It was very difficult work, but it made a huge, huge difference. They dealt with small offenses because they knew if you allow that to happen, it builds to bigger offenses. And they ended up creating one of the safest big cities anywhere in the world, and that was for a number of years. Now what's happened, they basically turned their back on those policies, and they have a persistent crime problem such that people are even being driven away from living there at all. So these things can change, and we just want to make sure in Florida that we understand how important it is to have safe communities. We understand the policies need to be strong, support for local law enforcement, but we got to do what we can to continue to build off the success. So I think we're going to have great support in the legislature. I know members of the law enforcement community that we've been able to work with on this have been very, very favorable. So I look forward to getting all this done over the next few months. And we're going to hear from some folks here to talk about why this is a good idea. So we'll start with our AG.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. 100% certainty, I have the best Attorney General job in the nation, working with this governor. And I tell him this all the time, safe communities don't happen by accident. And any time I have come to him, that you have come to him with a problem and said, this is happening, no, that can't be happening. How many times have you heard that? That can't be happening. Or when I hear about some of these national issues, like, why is that happening? Whenever you bring it to this governor's attention, he doesn't just sit back and wait to see if it gets fixed. He doesn't just sit back and wait to see what happens to us in Florida. He goes there. He is proactive. He starts talking to people about how we fix it. I really wish this country was run the same way, didn't you? This governor and I were down at our southern border years before our president went there, and when we heard that so many people, traffickers, smugglers, fentanyl poisoners, were headed to Florida, we knew we had to do something. That was years ago. And is it any doubt that we are now seeing fentanyl poison Americans at record rate? Last week, I shared a study that our youngest of children, under 14, the number of our young children that are now poisoned by fentanyl is skyrocketing. It's quadrupled by 2021. We have to do something. We have to take drastic steps. The lethal potency, coupled with the sheer volume that now is in our country and in this state, we have to take drastic action. I'm so thankful we have a governor that doesn't shy away from bold steps to fix problems. And so whether it's protecting our children from candy-wrapped drugs, whether it's making sure we have the funding to dedicate fentanyl strike teams to go after this in our communities. You know, it's a shock to me, and I would implore DOJ and thereby DEA to ensure that they had fentanyl-specific dedicated strike teams and groups in each one of their field offices. That's what we need in Florida, and through this funding and this legislation, we can get there. That's what taking proactive steps and being bold and brave and being a law and order governor means to a strong, safe state. And when you see nonsense in LA, in Portland, in Chicago, in New York, as violence and crime is skyrocketing, when you see leaders come in those that have run for an executive branch office that are charged with enforcing the laws given to them, say we're now going to try out soft on crime policies and cater more to the criminals than we do to the law-abiding citizens that are trying to keep their kids and families and communities safe. And when you see what's happening, and when drug agents arrest cartel members with tons of drugs and they're released before they see a judge, or someone's arrested 100 times in New York and again they're released, that is not common sense when it comes to criminal justice policy. In fact, common sense does not seem to be very common anymore in many parts of this nation, but it will reign supreme here in Florida. We will not let dangerous offenders get out of jail before they see a judge. We, the people of Florida, Floridians, and I don't just say this as an AG, I say this as a mom, we expect that the judges we elect make the important decisions we charge them with, because there needs to be accountability to we, the people, that trust them with these important roles. And if you have a computer or a staff member or a jail clerk signing off and releasing someone before they ever see a judge, and they're a repeat offender or a dangerous criminal, that's a problem. And that is what you are seeing all around this nation. And that is why I'm so proud of this governor and our legislative leaders that are saying, not up in here. It will not happen in Florida. So if you're thinking about trying out a social experiment here in one of Florida's communities, there will be safeguards, there will be assurances that the community understands the law will protect them, that we won't try out these experiments in your community. And Governor, I have to tell you, in many areas around this nation where they're passing legislation with some of this insane policy, even prosecutors, law enforcement, they're coming together and saying these policies will be disastrous. Look at our crime rates already. They will be disastrous. They're even calling some of these policies the Safety Act, trying to scam their populace. But not here. You know what today's announcement is about? It's about the real Safety Act. And we thank Governor DeSantis and we thank our legislative leaders. Thank you so much.
Whew, I'll tell you what, I have the best law enforcement job there is, working for the governor, and I thank you so much for having me here today. I'm FDLE Commissioner Mark Glass. Keeping Florida's communities safe is the cornerstone to the overall success of Florida. From economic development to tourism to education, it all starts with public safety. Governor Ron DeSantis knows the importance of keeping Florida's families safe, and because of that, his commitment to Florida law enforcement is unprecedented. I often hear from our partners. I hear from chiefs, I hear from sheriffs, I hear from troopers, agents, officers, deputies, and they say how much the governor supports means to them and their families. So many of our law enforcement colleagues across this country, they just don't have the support and leaders like we do here in Florida. It's no secret that law enforcement has experienced significant challenges over the past few years. And while Florida is a bright light for those who wear the badge, we aren't immune to these challenges. Fentanyl, you've heard here today, is an example of its killing 6,000 Floridians each year. Illegal fentanyl is being manufactured in Mexico and smuggled across the southern border. It is cheap, odorless, and tasteless. So Mexican cartels are mixing this fentanyl in a variety of drugs, including Adderall, Xanax, and making counterfeit prescription pills. But it's just not drugs. We know Florida is often a destination state for illegal immigrants. And in the effects of illegal immigration present a real cost to our citizens, both in terms of increased crime and stretching our law enforcement resources. With the support of Governor DeSantis, FDLE, and other law enforcement agencies have teamed up with the Florida Highway Patrol Criminal Interdiction Unit. The goal is to suppress criminal activity on our Florida highways and enforce violation of Florida statutes, including human smuggling, human trafficking, illegal drugs, and firearms. As a result of the 4 interdictions in the past 6 months, more than 200 individuals were arrested and charged with felonies, including 38 human smuggling charges and 66 drug charges. The total value of the drugs seized were nearly $630,000, and we also seized stolen vehicles and firearms. And with the governor's support, we will continue to organize and implement these interdictions. Our mission is one we all can agree on: to keep Florida citizens and visitors safe. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter who you are or where you're from. If your purpose is to come here to this state and hurt others and commit crimes, we're looking for you. We are looking for you. I want to thank Governor DeSantis for his steadfast commitment to Florida law enforcement and to the citizens of this great state. And also, as a father of a son who is now in a law enforcement academy, his mother and I are so thankful he chose Florida for his first law enforcement career. Thank you, Governor. Thank you for your time.
Good afternoon. As the governor said, my name is Captain Fernando Morales with the Homestead Police Department. And as you said, you have the best job and you have the best commissioner job. I think I can say for my brothers and sisters in law enforcement that it's a good time to be a police officer or in law enforcement in the state of Florida. Thank you. In some parts of the country, you're seeing this discussion, and especially here about this bail reform and all these things that are going on. In our community, our officers are arresting violent criminals just to see them released a couple days later, or if not, during the same shift. I can tell you a particular story that I had where I arrested a subject in the morning. By the afternoon, I already saw him walking the streets of Homestead committing crimes. And that's unacceptable. Just recently, we also had another case where a person had been arrested, is out on bond, committed a domestic violence offense. He was released within 24 hours, came home, and then committed an aggravated battery and child abuse. Now, these things are occurring every day in all of our jurisdictions here. One of the biggest frustrations as an officer and the victims we serve is arresting subjects where they're out on bond and committing these crimes. Some victims are acceptant to hearing, hey, why are these crimes this guy's outside? Well, you know what? I don't have an answer to that. But one thing I can do is I can investigate this crime, or I can make this arrest the best one possible. Sometimes they're accepting of that, but other times we have no other response when they ask a question, well, what can we do to change this? Well, we say, well, talk to your local politicians. But for us, it's extremely frustrating. Slowly, these tools that are given us as law enforcement are wanting to be taken away. But guess what? The mentality of these subjects where not having to face penalties for these crimes is present in their minds, and we have to change that. And I think that we're on the right path of changing that. Like I said, it's extremely frustrating. I think these initiatives and these legislations that the governor is putting forward is going to help us give us the tools to provide our safe communities, not only in Homestead, but also all throughout the state of Florida. Thank you, Governor, for these initiatives, and thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you.
First, I want to thank the governor for hosting us today and shedding light on such an important topic. My name is Kevin Loughran. I'm a law enforcement officer with the City of Wilton Manors Police Department in Broward County. I'm also the vice president of the Broward County Police Benevolent Association. I've been a police officer since 2010 and have served with the Wilton Manors Police Department since 2012. About 3 years ago, our agency established a Narcan program which allowed our police officers to carry Narcan on their persons to save lives. Since then, I personally have administered Narcan to citizens in need numerous times. I have now received approximately 3 life-saving awards because of different situations where I was able to use Narcan to stop an overdose death. Unfortunately, when I was originally contacted by the governor's staff in regards to what happened in these particular situations, I couldn't even recall the exact situation or the details of the situations because there's been so many of these life-saving interventions now that it's hard to keep track of them. In the last month, we revived 2 homeless people who were using drugs on a local bus stop. It ended up that the drugs that they had purchased had been laced with fentanyl. We had to Narcan both of them, and it did end up saving both of their lives. These two are very well known in our community, and we deal with them on a daily basis. In the past week, we responded to an overdose call where the victim had overdosed, had received Narcan, and then decided to run away from us because he believed that he had a warrant out for his arrest. I've had situations where we've had to break windows and pull people out of cars after traffic crashes that they've been involved in due to the overdose in order to administer them Narcan and bring them back to life. The list goes on, and it's almost a daily occurrence. Now, these rescue calls that we are running are not necessarily the bulk of the work that we are doing, but at its height of response, about a year ago, we were running up to 5 calls a day just in our small city. Now we're about 1 to 2 a day. As great as it is to rescue someone in need, there is nothing more heartbreaking when we don't get there in time. There was another situation where we went to an apartment and found a man who had been using. I administered Narcan to him and began performing CPR as he did not have a heartbeat at the time. Fire rescue responded. They continued the life-saving intervention. However, it was too late. He was declared brain dead and he died later, even though we administered all the care to him. The lethality of fentanyl is very hard to overstate. As police officers, we don't complain about the dangers of our jobs because we are committed to keeping our community safe. But the harsh reality is that fentanyl is not only poisoning our human officers and community, but also our canine officers, as well as the consequences can be tragic. In November 2016, we didn't know much about fentanyl. It had just started hitting the street. And we had 2 police dogs that we used to execute a search warrant that were almost killed because of suspected overdoses. Regional law enforcement was executing this search warrant with these 2 officers that were German short-haired pointers. We knew that there were drugs in the house because the dogs had done what they do best and indicated to us that there was odor of narcotics present. We saw some residue in the search area, but we weren't sure what it was. Once my colleague who handles these dogs finished the sniff with his drug-sniffing dog, he put him back in his cage in his truck and got his currency sniffing dog out of the vehicle and began the sniff with that second dog. He finished the sniff with the currency dog, came back to the car, tried to give his drug dog some water, at which point he started realizing that his dog was not acting the same. He was showing signs of sickness and was not his usual playful self, didn't want anything to do with the water or any toys that he had, so he very quickly rushed both dogs to a nearby animal hospital. He called ahead and informed them that the dogs were not acting normal and that they had just conducted a search warrant. Upon arrival, doctors administered Narcan to the dogs. The first dog was immediately administered Narcan and brought the dog back. The second dog, the currency dog, started displaying symptoms while the first one was being cared for. So the second dog also received Narcan, and they both were brought back. Thanks to the Thanks to the quick action of the canine officer's handler, these work dogs were saved and are still working today. Unfortunately, given how these dogs responded, we are extremely hesitant to send our police dogs into places where suspected fentanyl exposures can occur. It makes undertaking of the search warrants much more difficult for the officers, but it has a necessary concession to save the lives of our police dogs. If you take nothing else away from my remarks today, it's important to recognize that fentanyl poisoning is happening more frequently than I think anyone realizes. As police officers, we live the experience of the upticks in our community of these calls, and unfortunately we see first when someone decides to make a bad batch of their drug and it begins circulating in the area. There are real consequences, and despite our best efforts, we are still seeing people die and watching our fellow law enforcement officers be put in harm's way needlessly. Again, I want to thank the governor for continuing to raise awareness about the dangers of fentanyl and supporting our law enforcement in the area as we work to keep our communities safe. Thank you, sir.
Good afternoon. I would first like to start by thanking Governor DeSantis for the opportunity to speak today, but more importantly, for making fentanyl awareness a priority in his administration. My name is Megan Gillotti. I'm a wife and a mother of 2 amazing children. My youngest is Sophia. She is 18 and just graduated from high school. And my other child, my oldest, passed away from fentanyl poisoning on March 7th, 2021. He was 26 years old. His name was Louis, and he was a sweet, funny, loving, compassionate young man. He was also very accomplished. He received his bachelor's degree in psychology from FSU, and then at 25, he earned a master's degree in mental health counseling from FIU in July of 2020. Louis did everything that a parent could ever ask from their child. He finally got his first real job that September working as a youth therapist for kids in crisis. His young clients really felt a connection to him. His graduation and job took place during COVID. The anxiety and stress of a new job, combined with the loneliness and isolation during COVID, contributed to a decline in his own mental health, which unfortunately led to a terrible decision on that fateful day of March 7th when he bought cocaine that was laced unknowingly with fentanyl. He passed away almost instantly, and at that moment became forever 26. The world lost a beautiful person that day, and I lost my firstborn and my only son. Sadly, justice was never able to be served in Louis' case. Even though the detectives had an idea of who was ultimately responsible for his death, there just wasn't enough information to pursue a case against his killer. The loss of a child is a grief like no other. You are left with a gaping hole in your heart that can never be filled. You carry this loss with you every day. Not only did this tragedy end Louis' life, but it also caused so much pain to those he left behind. He was so loved and is so missed. Unfortunately, my story is all too common. My family was not the only one to suffer this loss. There are millions of grieving family members who are the living casualties of fentanyl. I have learned to manage the waves of grief over time. I rely on my faith to pull me through on those days where the waves threaten to overwhelm me. Louis' motto was, "Everyone has a story." He believed that, and he lived by that. It is now engraved on his headstone. Louis' story on this earth has been written, but I am here today as his voice to help warn and educate others of the dangers of this epidemic of fentanyl, the deadliest drug that this nation has ever seen, that is killing our loved ones to the tune of over 70,000 every year. Fentanyl poisoning is the leading cause of death in this country for those aged 18 to 45, and younger teens are also dying at an alarming rate. Fentanyl does not discriminate, no matter your race, religion, or economic status. Fentanyl is an equal opportunity killing machine. This is a problem that cannot be solved by just the advocacy of grieving family members of those lost to fentanyl. There must be a combined effort at the local, state, and federal levels to really make headway in this battle. Governor DeSantis is one of only a handful of governors in this country who understands the crisis we face and is actually working to do something about it. I am truly thankful to him for that. Now is the time for a serious, multifaceted federal response. We know where the fentanyl is coming from and how it is getting here. There is no more turning a blind eye. Too much time is being wasted. More and more of our children and loved ones are being poisoned with this insidious, deadly drug. Again, I thank Governor DeSantis for his brave efforts to bring this matter to the nation's attention. He is showing us that if we are willing to address this issue, we can begin to attack it. I ask that other governors and our federal elected representatives do the same and join Governor DeSantis in his efforts. Louis, you are right. Everyone has a story, and yours lives on. I thank you so much for your attention, and God bless.
Well, wonderful job. Thank you all for doing that. And I should be noted, I mean, this fentanyl almost all being made in China and almost all being brought across an open southern border. So we know where the sources of this are, and you know, we obviously are way downstream from that here in the state of Florida, but we're trying to attack it on all angles. And I think it's important because people's lives are at stake, and there's not been very many things. You look at the number of people that have died from this. This is more than like wars that we fought in recent years. I mean, it's really, really affecting communities all across the country. So we take it very seriously. We think these reforms will help in the battle against fentanyl. Okay, any questions?
While we're getting on the eve of another legislative session, another problem here besides just fentanyl is also high rent costs. Is there anything you can push state lawmakers that could ease the burden that renters have here in South Florida and across the state?
So the question's about living costs, particularly with rent. I mean, I think some of it was being driven by the worst inflation we've had in 40 years. And so people's utilities, everything, gas, all that has gone up over the last few years. And of course, the rent was a big part of that. I do think because we have so much multifamily that's been under construction in Florida, you are going to see more of that come online. You know, there has actually been, because I think 2021, it was like through the roof. You know, you've seen it ease up in terms of the increases. The Senate president, number one priority is to help provide more affordable housing throughout the state of Florida. So she's working on a very big proposal. You guys will be hearing about it very soon. I fully anticipate to be able to throw my support behind it, but I think it's going to cover a lot of different aspects of this. You know, part of the issue with South Florida is just this has been one of the number one places to go to over the last few years because you had so many other areas that were basically Faucivilles. So who wants to live there? They want to come to Miami. They want to move and do this. I mean, that's just the reality. One sec. Yes, sir.
Chris Nelson, Free Florida Epic Times. I have here in my hand a press release from the Department of Justice from Tuesday where two well-known Miami Antifa members, Caleb Hunter Freestone and Amber Smith Stewart, were arrested and charged with defacing and attacking pro-life pregnancy centers by putting graffiti on it. Your time is up. We're coming for you. We are everywhere. They face a maximum of 12 years in prison. We know these two very well as they antagonize and harass people at the school board down here. Governor, is it time that Antifa is labeled a terrorist organization? And what are you going to do with the new abortion laws coming forward to protect those pro-life pregnancy centers and attacks by Antifa directed at pro-life Christians?
Well, I was actually surprised to see that case brought because the Department of Justice had not been willing to hold those types of perpetrators accountable. Meanwhile, on the other side, you could have a pro-life advocate's got is a picket sign, and they're going to treat him like he's some hardened criminal. So there was a massive imbalance about how that's been handled. So to see that, I think, was a step in the right direction. They should be held accountable. What they are doing to try to intimidate these crisis pregnancy centers is wrong. And if there's things that we can do on the state to bolster that, we will support it. But just be clear, the DOJ has been asleep at the wheel on this for a long time. So I'm glad to see it. I am surprised to see it, but they need to do a lot more. Yes, sir.
Governor, when it comes to the bail changes proposal that's happening here in Miami-Dade County, part of it is a computer program that will decide if somebody is risky or not to let go. Do you have a position on if those computer programs should be used in this?
I don't know enough about it. I would just say my view would be I'd be very careful to think that somehow some algorithm is going to be better than human wisdom and human experience when you're talking about somebody that's a judge. And the good thing about it is if you have a circuit judge, that person can be voted out of office if they're releasing criminals. You can't vote an algorithm out of office. And so it's basically just subcontracting out self-government. Yes, sir.
Governor, Grant Miller Community Newspapers.
A couple of months ago, we broke the story about the chief judge making decisions how she's going to change bail reform. How can she make that decision by herself without going through your office, through the state? How can she do that? And what can we do to stop that?
Well, I think this package will stop it. I think this package will ensure that judges can't go rogue and are releasing people. Because this is, the tragedy of this is so much of what's been done to put people back on the street has been based on ideology. It's not been based off accumulated experience or sound judgment. It's been an ideological agenda. And there are times when you do that in public policy where the effects will usually be bad, but maybe not as calamitous. When you're talking about public safety, there are people in this country who have died at the hands of criminals who, under a normal law and order system, would not have been able to commit those crimes. They were only allowed to commit the crimes because of how they were treated with kid gloves by some of these so-called reformers. And so we don't think that that's appropriate. We oppose all the proposals I've heard along those lines. I think would be dangerous for the people in Miami-Dade. And, you've seen what can work. And I tell you, this is a very populated area. It's not easy to keep crime down, but they've done a good job. I think it's because they're holding the bad guys accountable, and that's what you have to do.
Governor,
yes, ma'am.
Two questions on two separate, really important issues. The first is February the 14th, will be 5 years since Parkland. If you're satisfied that there have been enough changes in Florida law to prevent or to try to prevent another school massacre. And the second is regarding the parole immigration program. Illegal crossings to the border have reduced significantly. The immigrants coming in through that program are checked, and they have a sponsor that's financially responsible for them. But there is a lawsuit that Florida is a part of. What bothers you about that program?
They're not following the law. That's what bothers us. So parole is not a license to nullify the law. And what they're doing is they are applying rules that are in direct conflict with the law. So we are a country based on the rule of law. If you want to change law to make the border even more open, you could do now. I would not support that. But the reality is they are just amending the law through executive fiat. And so Ashley has been leading that case. We believe we're going to win that case. I don't know when the judge is going to rule, but clearly they know what they're doing with that respect. And I think that it's just, when you talk about some of the things that they've been able to do, they don't have a handle of what's going on. I mean, you could sit there and say, we're going to give these people parole, even though it's not lawful, but how many other people have come? What has happened as a result? And it's been a really, really difficult thing, and they haven't exercised the proper leadership on that. Now, in terms of Parkland, we did the grand jury, the statewide grand jury. Soon after I became governor, of course, I suspended the sheriff, and the Senate terminated him from Broward. And you've seen changes in the school board and the superintendent and all that. So before I became governor, nobody had been held accountable for any failings. Now people have been held accountable. And so I think just having accountability is going to make it less likely that somebody like this guy gets passed around the system and everybody turns a blind eye, knowing that this guy was a problem. When that happened, the people in Parkland and throughout probably Broward, of course it was him. That's what they knew it was him without even being told that, because it was obvious that this guy was that. We've also dedicated close to $1 billion in my first 4 years as governor for school security. And these are common sense things that go a long way to be able to deter potential assailants. And I think what happened with Parkland and some of these others, Columbine, is they view the school as like a soft target where they can get maximum impact. And I think what we've been able to do in Florida is say, actually, it's not a good target for you. You're going to be met with resistance. You're not going to succeed. And so that's important. So we'll keep doing that, and we've been able to do a lot of legislative reforms. But I will say that does tie in here that I mentioned with the lack of a capital sentence. When this guy takes out all these innocent students, and some adults, but mostly these innocent students, and he ends up going to be in jail on or in prison on the taxpayer dime, and it's just wrong. And so we've got to get right on that. That was a bad Florida Supreme Court decision that has since been reversed and rectified. And so let's work with the legislature and make sure that going forward we have justice. And justice is not one person nullifying an otherwise appropriate and lawful sentence. All right, thanks, everybody.